Our next speaker is Kevin Bradley. Kevin is the State Extension Weed Specialist and an Associate Professor of Plant Sciences at the University of Missouri. So Kevin is going to talk about herbicide considerations with cover crops. Kevin?
All right. Thanks for the invitation. I do want to draw attention to my title because you're probably going to hear a little bit different perspective here than you're going to hear the rest of the day. And just understand that I kill for a living, so it is a little bit different kind of a perspective that I bring. When I think about cover crops, and we've started to do a lot of different things with cover crops to make sure we have answers for the clientele, but we see obviously more attention, more popularity given to this issue, probably because of the economic incentives associated with it. But when I think of cover crops, I think of, from a weed scientist perspective, there's still a lot of questions that remain unanswered, and so that's what we're trying to do here. What I'm going to talk about today, and these are kind of the three things that we've been working on. I'm primarily going to talk about questions 1 and 2 here, but we must be able to effectively kill whatever it is we're putting out there. So I'll talk about that a little bit. We must have a real understanding of what cover crops do for weed control. You saw in that survey that Rob presented, growers are saying it's the fourth most common thing that they're expecting out of a cover crop. And there is plenty of people that say they've seen this and they've seen that. I've done a pretty extensive literature review in the weed science and agronomy literature, and so in a 15-minute talk, I don't have time to bring all of that today, but all of my comments are going to go back to either what we've done or that literature search of what's been published thus far on this issue. And the third thing that I'm not going to talk about at all today because it's just not enough time, but it's really relevant for growers who are interested in cover crops, is that when we are in a corn or soybean system and we're spraying herbicides for weed control, obviously some of those herbicides can actually carry over to the cover crops you intend to plant. And there's really not a whole lot of information out there yet on that. There are a number of weed scientists throughout the Midwest and beyond, including us, that are doing a lot of research on that right now, on that very topic. And we're starting to get some answers, but there's certainly more that needs to be done on that. So I would usually never really show kind of materials and methods, but I think it's important for any of the research that I present here today, which won't be a lot, but it's important for you to understand how we did ours. And you may take issue with it or you may not, but this is just to illustrate what we have done over the past couple of years. So one of the things I would say is, in our corn and soybean studies, we are always removing the crop early as a forage type situation, whether it was silage or whatever, kind of simulating that. And we're planting these cover crops directly with a drill, and you can see here September 5th or 6th or September 11th, depending on the year. So you know, there is aerial seeding, and we haven't done any of that yet, and standing into corn and all of that, and I'm sure there's rationale for getting some of these established even earlier. But in some of the data I'm going to show, I just want to preface that with this one slide. And then also that these are our seeding rates. I would say for all of you cover crop experts in the audience, I wish you would come down with some publication or some definitive seeding rates, because that is a variable trait that just depends on which publication or manual you tend to be reading. And in my search looking for seeding rates, I've found values that are half of another publication here and there and all that. So I think there's still quite a bit to be worked out there, but that's what we did. So this is just a little preface to some of the research that I'll show later. The other thing, and again, this is my perspective, weed science perspective, I just don't think you can say all cover crops provide weed control, any more than I can say all all weeds are going to be controlled by all cover crops. And we tend to be a little bit too generic with this. And so I really think we need to think about species selection. And this species is one that gives me a moment of pause, let's say. I don't know of any weed scientist in the U.S. or beyond that really thinks Italian ryegrass, Lolium multiflorum, is a good idea for spreading around our fields. That is probably going to make me the least popular person in the room right now, but nevertheless, it is what it is. And it is one of the world's worst weeds. It is a fact, and I will show you some of that. But second to that, so the way I'm going to approach this is I report, you decide. The risks that I am mentioning may not be significant enough for you to abandon ryegrass. And there's plenty of people that just love this species for a cover crop because it establishes so well, because of its root structure, and all these other reasons. And I'm not discounting those at all. Okay. Second to that, though, there is tremendous confusion at the grower level. Maybe not in this room. Okay, I'm sure not in this room. But at the grower level, I still don't know that we're very clear about the difference between cereal rye and annual or Italian ryegrass. I gave a talk at the crop management conference just a few weeks ago on this issue for an hour, a weed scientist perspective on cover crops, and we invited Dave Robinson from Indiana, who did a great job speaking. He's an expert on cover crops. He's a grower that's used them for many years. And his first thing to me after I gave my talk is he said, "Kevin, you can't call that annual ryegrass." And I've already heard 3 or 4 times this morning everybody in here calling this species annual ryegrass. So I don't understand the confusion that is going on here. So here's my take on it. I call it annual ryegrass or Italian ryegrass. I'd love it if we'd all call it Lolium multiflorum, but that's not going to happen. And so it is the same species. It is the same species. We can get caught up in all the, well, it should be called Italian or it should be called annual or whatever. Just don't call it annual rye. Just don't call it cereal rye, okay? Whatever. You know, at the grower level, maybe not in this room, at the grower level, every winter meeting I do throughout the winter, and I mention ryegrass, there is a grower who raises their hands or come and sees me after the meeting to try to understand what is the difference between cereal rye and annual ryegrass. Okay, so we're missing something there. I'm not sure what it is. At some point, all of these were a good idea to plant. I'll just move on. Italian ryegrass, from a weed science perspective, we have 5 different herbicide mechanisms of action that are resistant, that this species is resistant to. Rigid ryegrass, which is not Italian ryegrass, rigid ryegrass is Lolium rigidum, is the world's worst weed from the standpoint of herbicide resistance. It has more different types of resistances than any other species. Is it Italian ryegrass? Is it Lolium multiflorum? No. But is it its first cousin? Yes. Okay. It is still a Lolium. And here's the distribution of resistant ryegrass in the U.S. We have resistance in Missouri to, and this might be too much of weed science talk here, but ACCase herbicides, which we would use in wheat to control it, or ALS herbicides, which we would use in wheat to control it. We have those populations. We do not, that I know of, have any glyphosate-resistant ryegrass yet, but we have some in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee, California, and Oregon. The only weed in the U.S. that has so far demonstrated resistance to Liberty or glufosinate is Italian ryegrass, and that occurs in other countries as well as in Oregon there. So this is just our map to this point in time of the different types of herbicide resistances we have in Lolium multiflorum. Here's the worldwide distribution of resistance in this species. So all I'm saying here, folks, for the whole reason for me to show this is I think we really need to think hard about species selection when it comes to cover crops. We've got a whole lot of data. There's been a whole lot of data published. Mike Plummer is going to come talk at lunch, I understand, about this as well. And this is not the be-all, end-all data. Don't get me wrong. There's way too much on the screen here to even go through. This is just some results from some studies we did last year. But the point is just this. When it comes to burn down, particularly of some of these difficult to control species, which I would put this on the top of the list, we must be timely with these applications. We had an early timing of a lot of our common burn down herbicides. We had a mid timing, and we had a late timing last year. And you know, you can just see that control. If you just kind of glance down the columns there, you can see that control reduce the longer you wait. And there's other studies that have been published in the literature that would be very similar to our results. And so I'd be glad to entertain questions about control and proper burn down. But the point here is we must be timely with these applications. So again, I'm reporting, you decide, and some of the benefits may outweigh these risks for you. But this, you know, as a state extension weed scientist, it is important for me to bring that up. So rather than show you a whole lot of data, which I don't have time for, just kind of some generic points about what the literature shows and what we've seen on effective kill or effective burn down of cover crops. As I've already said, you know, you have to be timely. If you're going to be a cover crop manager, you can't just be willy-nilly about this thing. It requires effort. You must be timely with your applications regardless of the species. For us, so far in our research, tillage radish and oats winter kill in central Missouri, and so we don't have any data on burning down tillage radish because it always dies. As I talk with my colleagues south of here in Tennessee, Arkansas, other places, that is not the case, and they have had some concerns with even killing some of the brassica species. But again, I don't have any data on that because it will just die out in our winters. Species that have proven difficult to control for us, number one, wheat. A lot of you probably are kind of maybe saying, what? You know, that sounds weird. We've had studies trying to kill wheat for decades, and you know, if you don't get the timing right, if you don't have the temperatures right, the herbicide right, it is a species that is difficult to burn down. It can be done, but I would certainly put it up there as one that's fairly difficult to control. Crimson clover also for us has been a little bit, you know, I'd say on the challenging side. We need to get a lot of growth regulator herbicides in the mix to burn that down effectively. And obviously the number one for me is Italian ryegrass as far as difficult to control. For us in our research, we really haven't seen any real trouble with controlling cereal rye, Austrian winter pea, or hairy vetch. And that's kind of a compilation of statements from the literature and from what we've seen as well. What kind of weed control can we really expect out of these cover crops? And again, I have to go back to, you know, you can't really call all these things equal. And so when I say weed control, I would say to that, well, what kind of weed control are you talking about? Are you talking about winter annual weeds, or are you talking about summer annual weeds? And so again, without a whole lot of data here, just some general statements. Cover crops on winter annual weeds, I think they're more effective than on summer annual weeds for sure. And that is mainly where we get most of our weed control, is on the winter annual weed species. But if you look at our data, if you looked at what's been published, I don't think you can count this as 100% kind of thing. You know, few things are. It's also dependent on the time of winter annual weed emergence. So again, getting some of these species established that much earlier, like in the corn, existing corn stand, may be very important, because there are many years where I can see henbit germinating before we've even harvested our corn crop. And so you've got to get ahead of that and get a good cover on some of these things before, so you can prevent those species from germinating. And again, it's dependent on the species or mix that you select of cover crops as far as winter annual weed control. I'm really more interested in summer annual weed control though, as far as what can these really do. And the primary reason I'm interested in that is because our number one problem right now in this state and really throughout the Midwest is resistant water hemp, or resistant pigweed species. By far, it is the number one species in the Midwest that we are contending with. So obviously a lot of us have researched to see if we can do anything for that weed. And again, I would say the 4 things here that are very important from a summer annual weed control standpoint. Again, the cover crop species selected. Number 2 may be the most important one. We have to get a good amount of biomass to cover that soil surface before you kill the cover crop. Otherwise, you're probably not going to get any summer annual weed control to any extent. Certainly the time of cover crop termination, and it's really dependent on the weed species. A little bit of data, the only data I'll show from our research. We have much more extensive data online at our website if you ever want to go, and we've got a whole presentation up there about cover crops. But this is just a bunch of different cover crops down through here that we have evaluated compared to some herbicide treatments. This was at Columbia last year, and what the bars show is cumulative summer annual weed emergence. So all summer annual weeds over the whole summer, and there's a lot of ways you can break down this data, but to make a long story short, we have seen cereal rye and wheat show some promise on summer annual weeds, as you can see there. That was at our Columbia site where we had a mix of weeds. And this is at our Moberly site, same study, just different site, where the only species there was resistant water hemp, the one that we're most concerned about. I do not know why wheat did not have an effect at Moberly, but it did not in that 1 year of research. But still, cereal rye showed some promise, very good promise, for reducing the emergence of this species. And so that's what I would say is we're lucky that we're going after it seems to me that the cover crops do have effects on small-seeded broadleaf weeds like water hemp. The thing that we saw in Columbia that's not shown here in this data, I could break it out and show it to you, but large-seeded broadleaf weeds like cockleburs, morning glories, giant ragweed, and etc., they really are not as affected by the cover crops as are the small-seeded broadleafs and the grasses. Others have done similar stuff, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to get to my last slide. But all this shows is some work done in Georgia on pigweeds, and you see early June, these cover crops are still having an effect, but asking a cover crop to last the whole summer on weed control, I think may be asking a little too much. There was no effect by July in that same study. So my final thoughts or kind of conclusions in this short time I've had, we really need to think about species selection. For me and most weed scientists, the species that show the most promise and the one we're least concerned about escaping and becoming a weed probably is cereal rye and wheat, and some of those that we've been using. The ones that we're probably most concerned about are certainly Italian or annual ryegrass, whatever you like to call it. Timely herbicide applications required regardless, and cereal rye and wheat in the literature and in our studies have been the ones that really show effects on summer annual weeds. All the other species, they have shown great effects on winter annuals. I haven't seen a whole lot on summer annual weeds yet to this point. And again, that might just be with need to be earlier established or things like that. So that's my 2 cents, I guess. And any quick questions before we move on? Yes, sir. And one back here.
Kevin, we know that the brassicas exude some gases and knock down nematodes. What, both short and long term, what will this do to some of the other mycorrhizae and some of the other good little buddies we've got working down in the soil?
Whoa, that's a great question for Dr. Kramer, who will be up here later talking about all of that. I have no idea, but I'm sure he can answer it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Do you see any benefit from the cereal rye?
For doing live streaming, you need to use that. Did you see any benefit from the cereal rye as far as suppressing weed growth from alleliopathy?
Yeah, so cereal rye, I mean, we haven't done the specific research to say, well, what is the mechanism, but others have, and I've looked into the literature on that, and cereal rye is certainly one species that we think we know that is both allelopathic, and so you get weed suppression in that way, and also just physically inhibits weed germination if you get that weed biomass thick enough and covering the soil, excuse me, soil enough. So there's two methods there with cereal rye. Not the case with every cover crop that's out there. I think there's one more, if we have time.
One more, Kip.
Yes, we do have time for one more.
Turn it on. Hello. One more. Just an observation that we've seen as much as 18 months of weed suppression with brassicas, some brassicas, which helps out your herbicide control the next year. We've seen suppression for 18 months, which I thought was significant.
Yeah, if you're seeing that, that is significant for sure. All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.